One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Aldo Leopold, A Sand County Almanac. I have come to accept the bittersweet nature of my mountain trips. I venture into the heights for solace from the political, social, and ecological demise that is raging across the planet. While camping at 7,000 feet in the central Cascade Mountains, I take in the view of the grand east face of Glacier Peak from atop Fortress Mountain. I gulp in the thick stars above. I find solace in the fact that those who are wrecking the planet will never be able to desecrate the stars. However, while marveling at the glaciers glowing in the morning sun on Glacier Peak, their rapid retreat is starkly highlighted by the barren earth below, where they once resided. My last trip was on October 20th, and from the summit, a 360-degree view revealed no less than 4 wildfires still burning. It was well into the fall in the Pacific Northwest, yet smoke still covered vast swaths of the state and was rapidly filling in the valleys below me. While hiking out later, the after effects were inescapable. Portions of the forest I hiked through bore the scars of previous wildfires, and served as a warning of more to come. The biggest news in the corporate media regarding climate change since my last dispatch has been the UN report stating that we have 12 years left to limit a full-on climate change catastrophe. To avoid this fate, we would need to spend those 12 years curbing global emissions dramatically. Essentially, there would need to be a government-mandated plan across the globe that would enable us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, 1.5 degrees Celsius, rather than the 2 degrees Celsius goal of the 2015 Paris climate talks. Eliminating that extra 0.5 of warming would save tens of millions of people from sea level rise inundation, and hundreds of millions from water scarcity and a myriad of other catastrophic impacts. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would, scientists have said, require a radical rethinking of virtually every facet of modern society, including an abandonment of our entire fossil fuel-based economy. However, currently, we are headed for at least a 3 degrees Celsius increase by 2100, with no mass government mobilization in sight. Meanwhile, the warnings that the catastrophe is already upon us continue. A recent study in a paper published August 31 in the journal Science warned that for each degree of rise in global temperature, insect-driven losses to the staple crops of rice, wheat, and corn increase by 10 to 25%. Given we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius warming, we are already seeing these losses, which are sure to increase. In 2016, the United Nations estimated that at least 815 million people worldwide don't get enough to eat, the University of Washington Press wrote of the study. Corn, rice, and wheat are staple crops for about 4 billion people, and account for about 2/3 of the food energy intake, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. At the same time, scientists are deeply concerned about the fact that non-pest insect numbers are declining rapidly. Bees, moths, butterflies, ladybugs, and other insects are far less abundant, and scientists around the world warn that these insects are crucial to as much as 80% of all the food we eat. You have total ecosystem collapse if you lose your insects, University of Delaware entomologist Doug Tallamy told the AP. How much worse can it get than that? Meanwhile, in the realm of sea level rise, things are irreversibly catastrophic. A recent study of Antarctic ice sheets shows them to be far more sensitive to temperature increases than previously believed. The study showed that when global temperatures were only slightly warmer than they are currently, sea levels were 20 to 30 feet higher than they are right now. It doesn't need to be a very big warming, as long as it stays 2 degrees warmer for a sufficient time. This is the end game, David Wilson, a geologist at Imperial College London and one of the authors of the new research, told the Washington Post. Equally disturbingly, lakes in the Arctic are literally bubbling and hissing. They are releasing methane in large quantities as the ground underneath them thaws. Methane is a greenhouse gas 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide on a 10-year time scale, and the widespread release of methane was a key driver of the Permian mass extinction event which annihilated more than 90% of life on Earth. Meanwhile, the Arctic sea ice is melting rapidly. Ice extent reached its annual minimum recently, which is normally when the ice would begin reforming rapidly, particularly right in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Instead, the ice continued to decline. To underscore how governments are not doing enough to mitigate climate change impacts, Brazil, a major greenhouse gas-emitting country, recently elected right-wing extremist Jair Bolsonaro as president. To say he is anti-environment, in addition to homophobic, racist, and sexist, would be a gross understatement. Known as the Trump of the tropics, his plans include disempowering federal environmental agencies, opening up indigenous reserves in the Amazon to mining and farming, and building hydroelectric dams in the rainforest, where deforestation, already at crisis levels, is set to explode. Earth. Impacts of human-caused climate disruption across the terrestrial plane are becoming increasingly stark. A recently published study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences revealed that global insects are in a crisis, and the problem is even more widespread than previously realized. While previous studies had revealed a 45% decrease in invertebrates like bees and beetles in the last 35 years and another study showed a 76% decrease in flying insects in the last few decades in German nature preserves, the new study shows a startling loss of insects now extending into the Americas. The report cites climate change as the cause. This is one of the most disturbing articles I have ever read, David Wagner, an expert in invertebrate conservation at the University of Connecticut told the Washington Post of the study. Another recent study, also in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showed that more than 300 species of mammals have been driven to extinction by human activities. The study showed that even if humans ceased destroying wilderness areas and ended poaching and pollution within 50 years, and extinction rates fell back to normal levels, 5 to 7 million years would be required for the natural world to recover from what we have done to it. We are doing something that will last millions of years beyond us, Matt Davis, a research leader at Aarhus University in Denmark, told The Guardian. It shows the severity of what we are in right now. We're entering what could be an extinction on the scale of what killed the dinosaurs. That is pretty scary. We are starting to cut down the whole tree of life, including the branch we are sitting on right now. In the US West, a region iconic for its vast expanses and the freedom to roam in the wilderness that comes with them, some people refer to themselves as prisoners of the environment, as reported in this piece in The Guardian, due to increasingly unhealthy air quality from wildfire smoke, water shortages, and drought. Many residents are now wondering whether they should move. Longer, hotter fire seasons, increasingly warm temperatures, less snowfall, changes in plants, and shorter winters are in the process of fundamentally changing Yellowstone National Park in the next few decades. That conclusion is pretty much inescapable, John Gross, ecologist with the National Park Service's Climate Change Response Program, told USA Today. It's really more a question of the when and how it occurs than if. And it's not just Yellowstone. The recently published study, Disproportionate Magnitude of Climate Change in United States National Parks, has shown that the parks have warmed twice as fast as the US average, and could well see the worst impacts of climate change. This is due to the fact that vast portions of national park areas are located at higher elevations, in the arid southwestern US, or in the Arctic. The iconic trees of Joshua Tree National Park may soon find their environment uninhabitable. Glacier National Park will eventually be free of glaciers. And many other national parks could be left virtually unrecognizable by climate change. Meanwhile, as permafrost continues to thaw and water seeps deeper into mountain crags, increasingly severe storms, thanks to climate change, will destabilize mountains and increase the risk of landslides and rockfall. Speaking of permafrost, a recent report showed that coastal erosion in the Arctic is intensifying climate change. As the coast there eroded during the end of the last glacial period, 20,000 years ago, dramatic amounts of the frozen CO2 were released into the atmosphere. Now, this feedback loop with climate change causing melting causing CO2 release, and CO2 release exacerbating climate change is beginning to occur again. A recent study in Canada's British Columbia showed that climate change is pushing alpine animals higher up mountains, as well as into extinction. The study showed that both plants and animals are shifting upslope 100 meters for every 1 degree Celsius in temperature increase. It's not just plants and animals being forced to higher ground. Some humans in the US are also moving to higher ground, as the era of mass climate migration has begun. The Great Migration in the US, a period. During the 20th century, when roughly 6 million black people fled the Jim Crow South for cities elsewhere, was the previous largest internal migration in the US. One study showed that by the end of the century, sea level rise alone could displace 13 million people, 6 million of those in Florida alone. That number doesn't include people fleeing drought and wildfire-prone areas, nor those having to move for lack of water, or ensuing violence. Making matters worse, another leading climate scientist warned that 15 to 20 feet of sea level rise is possible within the next 70 years. That amount of sea level rise would mean the end of, literally, every major coastal city on Earth. The number of people displaced would be in the hundreds of millions, as New York City, Boston, Miami, Lagos, Jakarta, Shanghai, Mumbai, New Orleans, vast swaths of Boston, and Ho Chi Minh City would all be underwater. A recent report from Yale 360 argued that the current system of rating hurricanes needs to be scrapped, because it fails to account for how climate change augmented hurricanes are now carrying far more powerful storm surges, often moving slower, and bringing flooding from rainfall that the current system cannot account for.